1518. The city of Strasbourg. A hot, miserable summer. One day, a woman steps out of her house into the street and begins to dance. There is no music. There is no celebration. She just dances. Hours pass, and she does not stop. A day passes, and she is still dancing, her feet bleeding on the stones. Within a week, dozens are dancing with her. Within a month, around 400. And some of them are about to dance until they die. This really happened, and to this day, no one is completely sure why. To understand how something this strange could happen, you first have to understand the city it happened in. Because Strasbourg, in the year 1518, was very far from a happy place. It was a busy, walled town of merchants, craftsmen, and day labourers packed tightly together inside its stone defences. Tens of thousands of people lived crammed into narrow, filthy streets. The houses leaned over the lanes, built of timber and plaster, floor stacked on floor. There were no sewers worth the name, and waste ran openly down the middle of the street. Life was ruled by the guilds, the carpenters, the tanners, the bakers, and by the church, which towered over everything from the great cathedral at the city's heart. Strasbourg sat near the Rhine, a river of trade and money. On a good year, that made it prosperous. But the years leading up to 1518 had not been good years. One harvest failed, then another. Grain grew scarce, and the price of bread, the thing that kept the poor alive, climbed higher and higher out of their reach. For ordinary families, hunger was not a fear. It was a daily fact. A labourer might work all day and still not earn enough to feed his children that night. People sold their tools, their clothes, anything they had. Beggars filled the squares, and many families were only one failed winter away from starving to death. And where there is hunger, disease follows close behind. Weakened, half-starved bodies had no defense against the sicknesses moving through the crowded streets. Smallpox scarred the survivors. Syphilis, a terrifying new disease, was spreading fast. And a mysterious, sweating sickness could kill a healthy man in a single day. Leprosy and other illnesses left people disfigured and broken, shut out of normal life, begging for scraps at the gates of the churches. By 1518, the people of Strasbourg were exhausted, frightened, and squeezed to the very edge of what a human being can endure. And in their minds, all of it carried a meaning. This was a profoundly religious world, where almost nothing happened by accident. Good fortune was a blessing, and suffering was a message, punishment from God for the sins of mankind. And it was a world that felt like it was coming apart. Just 1 year earlier, in 1517, a monk named Martin Luther had nailed up his protest and split Christianity wide open. People felt the old certainties cracking beneath their feet. Many were convinced the end of the world was near, and that God's anger was about to fall on them all. To survive in a world like that, people leaned on the saints, holy figures who could protect you, heal you, or, if you crossed them, destroy you. And in this region, along the Rhine, one saint in particular cast a very long and very dark shadow over people's imaginations. His name was Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus was a protector, but he was also feared. People believed that if you insulted him, or simply caught his anger, he could strike you with a horrifying curse. That curse was this: he would seize control of your body and force you to dance. Not for fun, but helplessly, without rest, unable to stop yourself no matter how you tried. It sounds bizarre to us now, but to a hungry, frightened, deeply religious people in 1518, the dancing curse of St. Vitus was as real as the plague. Keep that belief in your mind. It began on a single day in mid-July with just one person. Her name, as far as the city's records tell us, was Frau Trophäa, an ordinary woman of Strasbourg. She stepped out into a narrow street, and with no music playing and no warning at all, she began to dance. Alone, in the middle of the day, in front of her neighbors. At first, the people around her probably thought it was strange, maybe even a little funny. A grown woman, swaying and spinning by herself in the dust of the street. But she did not stop. The morning turned into afternoon. The afternoon turned into evening. And still she kept moving, as if she simply could not make herself stand still. She danced straight through the night. Soaked in sweat, her body visibly exhausted and shaking, but somehow unable or unwilling to bring herself to a halt. Her family tried to stop her. They held her down, sat her on a chair, begged her to rest. But the moment they let go, her arms and legs started moving all over again. By the second day, her feet were torn and bleeding on the rough cobblestones, leaving smears of blood with every step. And still, somehow, she danced. A crowd gathered to watch this impossible thing. Some prayed for her soul. Some whispered about Saint Vitus. And then the thing that no one expected began to happen. After 4, 5, 6 days of this, Frau Troffea was no longer dancing alone. Out of the watching crowd, another person had stepped forward and started to dance too. Then a third joined. Then a fourth. Whatever had taken hold of that one woman now seemed to be reaching out and taking hold of the people around her. At first it was only a handful, a few more people in the street, moving in the same restless way, with the same blank, driven, far-away look in their eyes. But it spread with frightening speed. Within days, dozens of people across Strasbourg were dancing in the streets and the squares, and they couldn't seem to stop either. They filled the open spaces of the city. But to anyone watching, it was clear this was no celebration. There was no music they were following, and no joy at all in their faces. Witnesses described twisted, agonized faces. Some of the dancers were screaming and crying out for help, even as their own bodies kept jerking and spinning against their will. People danced until they simply collapsed from exhaustion. And then, after lying still for only a little while, many of them staggered back to their feet and started dancing all over again. Desperate families dragged their husbands, wives, and children home and tied them to their beds. But the sickness, whatever it was, did not let go that easily. The number kept climbing, day after day. By some accounts, within about a month, as many as 400 people had been pulled into the dancing. Picture it, hundreds of citizens, all across the city, dancing themselves into the ground in public, while their neighbors watched in horror and prayed it would not take them next. For the men who ran Strasbourg, this was no longer a curiosity. It was a full-blown emergency, unfolding in the open streets, and it was completely out of their control. They argued about what to do. Was it a punishment from God, the work of the devil, or something in the bodies of the dancers themselves? In the end, they turned to the experts of their age. The city brought in its physicians to examine the dancers, and these learned men reached a firm conclusion. This was not the work of a saint or a demon. It was a physical illness. Medicine in 1518 was built on an ancient idea that the body held 4 fluids, called humours, and that good health depended on keeping all 4 of them in careful balance. Their diagnosis for the dancers was hot blood. The dancers, they declared, were suffering from overheated blood, and the only way to fix it was to let that hot blood burn itself out. And from that diagnosis came one of the most catastrophic medical decisions in recorded history. The cure for the uncontrollable dancing, the physicians decided, was even more dancing. The city threw itself into the plan. They cleared out 2 of the guild halls and an open-air grain market, just to give the afflicted plenty of room to keep on moving. They even built a large wooden stage out in the open air. The idea was to gather the dancers together and let them dance in front of the whole city, where everyone could see. And then they did the single most baffling thing of all. The city hired professional musicians, pipers and drummers, and paid them to play loud, lively music for the dancers. They went even further. They paid healthy, strong men to step in among the sick and keep them moving, to dance alongside them and help them dance the sickness out of their bodies. So now the city of Strasbourg was deliberately pouring fuel onto the fire. Music, stages, crowds, and fresh dancers, all of it surrounding people who were already collapsing and dying. As you can probably guess, this did not burn the sickness out of anyone. Instead, it did the exact opposite. It made the entire situation dramatically, catastrophically worse. With the heat of high summer, and now with music driving them on day and night, the dancers' bodies began to break down completely. Hearts gave out. People suffered strokes. According to one chronicle from the time, at the very height of the madness, around 15 people were dying in Strasbourg every single day from the dancing. Day after day it went on. The music played, the crowds gathered, and one by one the dancers dropped to the ground, exhausted, broken, and did not get back up. Eventually, even the city's leaders could no longer ignore the obvious. Their own cure was not saving anyone. It was helping to kill them. And so, at last, they reversed everything. They banned the music. They tore down the stages. Public dancing, music, and large gatherings were suddenly forbidden across the entire city, on pain of punishment. And then they turned back to the one explanation that, deep down, almost everyone had believed from the very beginning. This was the curse of St. Vitus. The dancers who were still alive were gathered up, loaded into wagons, and carried out of the city to a shrine dedicated to St. Vitus, up in the hills. There, priests prayed over them and performed rituals to lift the curse. They gave the dancers small wooden crosses and even put red shoes on their feet, begging the saint to release them. And whether it was the rituals, or simply the rest, the quiet, and the removal of the music and the crowds, the dancing finally, slowly, began to fade away. By the end of that summer, it was over. The streets of Strasbourg fell silent again, as if the whole nightmare had never happened. But it had left a terrible mark behind. Dozens of people, possibly many more, were dead. And the city was left with a question that would outlive everyone who had witnessed it. A question we are still arguing about today. So what could possibly make hundreds of people dance themselves to death? Over the centuries, a few serious explanations have emerged. And the first one blames something very ordinary: the food. Specifically, it points to a fungus called ergot, which grows on rye, especially in damp, wet conditions. And after a string of cold, wet seasons, ergot would have been common. When that infected rye was ground into flour and baked into the bread that the poor ate every day, the poison went straight into their bodies. And ergot is genuinely powerful. It is chemically related to the drug LSD. Ergot poisoning can cause violent convulsions, terrifying hallucinations, and a burning, crawling sensation in the arms and legs. On the surface, it fits. But there is a serious problem with the ergot theory. The poison also chokes off the blood supply to the limbs, which usually leads to gangrene. Someone poisoned badly enough to convulse and hallucinate could not possibly coordinate their body to dance, in rhythm, for days on end. The symptoms simply don't match what witnesses saw. And ergotism doesn't usually leap from person to person through a crowd, the way this dancing clearly did. So most historians have set the poison theory aside and looked somewhere else entirely. That other place is the human mind. The leading explanation today is what doctors call a mass psychogenic illness, what most of us would loosely call mass hysteria. The core idea is unsettling. Under extreme, relentless psychological stress, the suffering in the mind can break out and physically take over the body, with no conscious control at all. And remember the world these people lived in. Strasbourg in 1518 was drowning in stress. Famine, deadly disease, religious terror, and crushing poverty, all crashing down at the same time. The historian John Waller, who has studied this event in depth, argues that this perfect storm of stress is exactly what set the stage for what followed. But stress alone does not make a person dance. This is where that belief in St. Vitus, the one I told you to remember, becomes the missing key to the whole thing. These people did not just half believe in the dancing curse. They knew, with total certainty, that St. Vitus could seize a body and force it into an endless, deadly dance. So when one exhausted, terrified woman finally cracked under the strain and slipped into a kind of trance, dancing without control, that shared belief did the rest of the work. Everyone watching her fully expected the curse to be real and to spread. And in a deeply suggestible, terrified crowd, that expectation became a self-fulfilling prophecy, jumping from mind to mind. And now look back at the city's so-called cure. The stages, the crowds, the loud music. It was the perfect machine for spreading that exact suggestion to as many people as possible. This is the explanation most experts now accept. Not poison, and not the supernatural. Real human bodies pushed clean over the edge by unbearable stress and a single, powerful, shared belief. And here is the part that makes the whole story even more unsettling. The Strasbourg outbreak of 1518 was not a freak, one-time event. It was the last great chapter in a much older pattern. Outbreaks of uncontrollable, contagious dancing had been erupting across Europe for centuries before Strasbourg. Again and again, in town after town, one of the largest of them all struck the lands along the Rhine and the Mosel rivers. In the year 1374, more than a century before Frau Troffea ever stepped into the street, thousands of people, in town after town, were reported dancing, screaming, and collapsing in the streets. Some danced their way straight into the churches, begging the saints to free them. There are even older, stranger stories. One chronicle tells of a group of children in 1237 who danced and hopped all the way from one German town to another, many of them collapsing at the end. Another tells of around 200 people in 1278 who danced on a bridge over a river until the bridge itself gave way beneath them and threw them into the water. Historians have a single name for this whole phenomenon, stretching across the medieval centuries. They call it choreomania, the dancing mania. And these outbreaks share a chilling pattern. They flared up almost exclusively in places that had just been crushed by famine, flood, or plague, among people steeped in the same religious fears. Strasbourg in 1518 is simply the most thoroughly documented case of all. It's the one where the city's own records survive in enough detail for us to truly study what happened. There is one more piece to this puzzle, and it comes from far to the south, in the sun-baked villages of southern Italy. There, a strange cousin of the dancing mania survived for centuries. People believed that if you were bitten by a particular spider, a tarantula, the venom would drive you into a frenzy that could only be cured one way. The cure was to dance. Musicians would be called in to play fast, driving music, and the victim would dance furiously for hours, even days, supposedly sweating the poison out of their body. This is where the famous Italian folk dance, the tarantella, actually comes from. It began not as a celebration, but as a desperate, sweating cure for a supposed deadly bite. Tarantism lasted in parts of Italy for hundreds of years, long after the medieval dancing manias had faded. The spider, most likely, had little to do with it. Like the dancing plague, it seems to have been driven by belief and emotion, a culturally accepted way for people, often poor women, to release unbearable stress through a trance-like dance. A few years after the Strasbourg outbreak, one of the most famous physicians in Europe, a man known as Paracelsus, came to the city and wrote down what people told him about the dancing. He flatly rejected the idea that St. Vitus had anything to do with it. To him, blaming a saint was just superstition. an excuse that explained nothing about the real cause. Instead, he argued that the dancing came from within the people themselves, from the imagination, from emotion, and from the mind acting on the body. Centuries early, he was groping toward the modern answer. It would take a very long time for science to catch up to him, but the basic insight he reached back then still stands at the center of how we explain the dancing plague today. And if you think this belongs safely in the superstitious past, here's the uncomfortable part. Mass psychogenic illness did not vanish with the Middle Ages. It still happens today. In 1962, at a girls' school in what was then Tanganyika, in East Africa, a few students started laughing and could not stop. Within hours, it had spread to dozens of others. It was not happy laughter, fits of laughing and crying, some lasting days. The school was shut down, but that didn't stop it. As the girls went home, it spread through the villages, affecting around 1,000 people. There are many other cases, outbreaks of fainting or twitching, that sweep through schools and factories, where doctors examine everyone and find nothing physically wrong at all. The pattern is almost always the same as in Strasbourg: a tight group under heavy stress, a shared fear, and one trigger. The mind, under enough pressure, can still do this to the body. So, 500 years later, can we say for absolute certain what happened in Strasbourg in 1518? Honestly, no. Not with complete, final certainty. But the strongest answer isn't a poison, and it isn't a curse. It's the frightening, hidden power of the human mind, when it's pushed past its limits. A reminder that what people deeply believe doesn't just stay in their heads. It can reach right down into their bodies and do very real, and sometimes deadly, things. Hundreds of ordinary people once danced themselves to death in a city that first paid musicians to keep them going, and then begged them to stop. And almost no one today knows it happened. So what do you think really drove them? Poison or the mind? Tell me in the comments. And subscribe. There are plenty more true stories like this one, the kind that sound impossible, but really happened.